the 2021 Cayman 718 GT4. And in this video, we're going to take a very technical deep dive. We're going to put this up on the lift, compare it to the prior generation 981 GT4 from an engineering perspective, drive this on the street, walk you through the dynamic differences between these two generations of cars, and then drive this on the track, flat out at Autobahn Country Club, where we walk through what this thing is like to drive at its limits. So enjoy. Inside the 718 GT4 Cayman, unless you are the most diehard of Porsche fans, you're probably going to struggle, at least at a glance, to tell the difference between this product and the prior generation 2016 981 Cayman GT4. And to be honest, at least from an interior perspective, they are largely the same product with one key change. The interior technology has been updated. We have an all-new gauge cluster with an 8,000 RPM tach and a significantly improved infotainment system with Apple CarPlay. Past that though, the dash layout, the seating options, and all the switchgear is essentially the same. Speaking of seats, you have three different options. You have two variants of the touring seat with varying degrees of adjustability and a fixed back carbon bucket right out of the GT3. Past that though, this is largely a carryover from the other 718s we've covered, which means everything can be changed a la carte, from dash material to steering wheel material to contrast stitching and even the interior material inlays. You can go from this brushed aluminum to a carbon fiber, all for a cost, of course. I will bring up two things. One, this is the Cayman variant, which means it's a hatchback. You still do get a frunk and a trunk when compared to its convertible counterpart, the Boxster or Spider, but you do get reduced road noise, thankfully. However, there is more engine noise in this car. It is ever present, and that's largely because, unlike in the Boxster or Spider variants of this vehicle, you are not separated from the engine. The engine is in the passenger compartment right behind the seats, so you can always hear it, which is either a pro or a con depending on who you are. But past that, I think it's time we put this up on the lift and talk about the technical engineering differences between this product and the prior generation Cayman GT4.
We are under the latest generation Porsche GT4. The GT4 products, Jack, are what?
They are the motorsports variant of the Cayman or Boxster. We already did the Boxster variant, which is called the Spider, and yes, there are body differences, but I wanted to save most of the technical comparisons for this. This is the 718 GT4. It replaces the prior generation 981 GT4, and I showed you some of the B-roll of both cars, and let's be honest, you struggle to tell the difference.
I do. I can't tell the difference at all, and you know, I'm not a Porsche fanatic, but I think what it goes to show is the subtle changes are there to keep that timeless look and proportions without going crazy.
All the changes they made to the exterior and the mechanical bits are for functional improvements. And yes, 12 seconds sounds like a lot, but on the ring, it's not that much. But that's how much faster this is than the prior generation 981. And the main difference, other than the all-new engine and the inclusion of an automatic gearbox, the PDK, is Aero. So the front and rear fascias are all new. If you look at the front bumper, there's a larger front splitter. In the back, there's a rear diffuser and a new rear wing. All of that culminates in 50% more downforce, and that is a significant amount when compared to the prior generation vehicle, and with no penalty, essentially, for an increase in drag. So this car produces more downforce without being slowed down. And most of that comes from the underbody paneling and the rear diffuser. Of that 50%, 30% of it comes from clever use of underbody aero panels, which is huge.
So they didn't just test the aerodynamics in the RV's drive-thru, they actually put this in a wind tunnel to handle most of the redesign. And you just have to really get under here to appreciate it. The golf ball style front panels, and like Jack's gonna talk about the aero panels and the differences here, it is quite remarkable. This is a special car in that regard.
And it does help that they have an actual racing program built around the GT4. It's a GT4 club sport, much like the GT3 Cup car. Many of the technological improvements come directly from the racing program, which is one of the reasons why these cars are so special. At its core, this generation product is called the 982, replaces the 981, and to be honest, the body in white is essentially the same. So that means this car is still strut front and rear, which is Actually pretty interesting, if I'm going to be honest.
I mean, there's just not too many mid-engine sports cars even left. You know, you had the Alpha 4C, which had a strut back, I think.
But that's due to packaging, essentially, because it's a mid-engine car.
Right.
That is definitely a compromise when compared to something like a C8 Corvette. But I will say this has full suspension adjustability, front and rear, which means you can adjust the sway bar, adjust the ride height, which means day one you can do a corner balance on this car. The struts, front and rear, as you're going to see, look remarkably similar to the prior generation vehicle, and look even more similar to the last generation GT3, the 991.1 and .2.
Yeah, because it has the external helper springs on the damper bodies. And mostly all of the same suspension architecture in the front is all GT car from the GT3 handed down. Knuckles.
The strut cars.
The strut cars. So knuckles, shock bodies, control arms, all of that.
When it comes to the brakes, very quickly, Mark, you have two options. You have the carbon ceramics, which this car does not have, and the steel rotors, which you have some problems with. That's
probably the only thing I really have a problem with, other than, you know, strut has its inherent deficiencies in terms of on the track. And we didn't have a track alignment on this, so I don't want to go too deep into that. But the brakes, you look at them, and clearly they made a design choice to put as many cheese holes in the rotors as possible. And my guess is it's probably for harmonic tuning to get rid of some of the brake squeal. But what you have is a rotor that is just loses so much surface material from those holes. All they do is fill up with brake pad material, and I feel like the braking force wouldn't be as good as if you just did a flat face rotor with some slots, like a more traditional rotor. And yes, it would increase noise, but on a car like this, you know, I want to track it. I want the brakes, and that's the only real complaint I have about it.
All right, Mark, let's get in the back.
All right. Oof. It's hot back here, Jack. I'd like to cool off with a nice box Franzia white wine again. But why is it so toasty back here?
Because you have an all-new engine. This is the 4-liter. We've seen it before in the Spider and the GTS 4-liter, but I want to talk about a couple things. First off, this motor, from a technical perspective, is far superior versus the last generation engine. This engine makes peak power at the very top of its RPM band, where the 981 GT4 does not. It dies off at the top, which is the exact opposite of what you want in a dedicated sports car with now an 8,000 RPM redline.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference. This car makes more power up top, makes subtly more torque, and its peak figures of only having like 30 or 40 more horsepower. This makes like 414, and that made in the mid to high 300s. That doesn't tell the whole story. It's when you're actually driving it and you see
flat out.
Yeah, flat out.
When you're going on a track like you're supposed to in those high RPM, that high RPM area, that top part is where you're living most of your time. On the street, it's less of an issue, but I noticed it instantaneously, and I'm like, wow, this feels way more special. So what else? This 4-liter, as we've beaten to death, is in the same engine family as
everything
much
else, other than the GT3 motor, which it's got integrated sump into it. The big story is gearbox options. The manual transmission is identical, including gear ratios, to the prior generation vehicle, but you now get a PDK, which this car has. Really, it's the player's choice, or whatever the expression is. What you want is now, there's not really a better option. If they both have similarly long gears, you know, if you want to get in the top of third, you're going to be triple digits in both cars. It's the same. It's just, do you want 3 pedals or 2? I'm going to leave it up to you. What do you think is better?
If you really care, you do it like your buddy. He just goes out and had it re-geared.
Jabron, if you're watching this, we have a viewer who bought a Spider and then proceeded to spend another Spider on top of it in modification.
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, at least you know you can do it if it bothers you that much.
Past that, though, this still has PTV, Porsche torque vectoring, in the rear differential. And the big story, too, other than the engine, is if you look at this big diffuser. If you look at this car versus the old one, look how massive it is. And the mufflers themselves act as a part of the rear diffuser.
It smooths out the airflow in the back half of the airflow from the back here. So it's just creative use to, like you said, what can we do to make this car faster without really reworking the whole car? And Aero is something, as we know, with technology and materials and all of that, that's, I wouldn't say easier, but it's one of the best things you can do from a performance perspective for driver confidence at higher speeds.
And this is a car you're supposed to take to the track. So with that, Mark, let's put this on the street, do a little bit of a street drive, and then more importantly, take this to Autobahn Country Club. .718 GT4, Mark.
I'll be curious to see if you're still going to want to buy one when we're done with these drives, Jack.
Let's do this as a really brief street drive because let's be honest, this car is best suited on the track. But I want to talk about how this compares to the previous gen car, what this thing's like to live with, and what the PDK's like. But first, the launch.
Never gets old.
No.
The launch is just, it's like so race car. You take anybody in that 4-cylinder 718 we had and you're just kind of like, yeah. And then you put him in here, you're like, yeah. I mean, this is just like a totally different experience because of that sound.
This 4-liter paired with the PDK, and you and I would probably still both get the manual, is very, very impressive. I briefly drove the previous generation 2016 981 GT4 with a owner's car, Bob, who was kind enough to let me drive it. Like we talked about in the shop, the big thing you're going to notice is this motor feels way better.
Mm-hmm.
You did not like the prior generation engine when you first did your video on it.
It didn't feel special enough, and explain to me why.
Because this car makes peak power at the top of his RPM band where the last motor didn't. To me, the differences between these cars, and I know we're going to talk about it in our upcoming long-form GT3 video, feel very similar to the differences in the 991.1 GT3 to the 991.2. The car's more compliant, it rides better, it's just subtle improvements that you do notice when you drive them back to back, but in a vacuum, I don't think, you know, the $30,000 or $40,000 delta will get people out of a 2016 GT4 into this. But if you were looking to buy one versus the other, this is clearly the superior car. It still has the same gearing problems, which means they're very, very long. Still has a lot of road noise, which is kind of what you're expecting in a GT.
What about ride, though? Like for street purposes before we take this to the track?
I did about 200 miles on it on our back and forth to Autobahn and all the other fun stuff, and it's stiff. It's not going to beat you up, but this is not a car you're going to want to drive to like California from Chicago. It's going to get old pretty quick. But past that mark, I think it's time for us to explore the limits of this vehicle at a real racetrack. How does that sound to you? 8,000 RPM into the braking zone. Good brakes. Oh, good gearbox too, Mark.
Oh,
PDK, 4-liter. Oh yeah.
Didn't I ask for a 6-cylinder over the 4-popper?
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that. This is
it's on another planet. Come on.
This is peak 718, and I'm gonna agree with you. This is the only one you should. This is the only one you should own, Mark.
Mr. Wipers.
So what do you think after riding it for a couple seconds?
Oh my God, this thing is fucking nutty. I mean, obviously this is peak driver's car right here. This is the best Porsche can do for a street car along with the GT3. This is everything I expected and even more. I can see why you want to own this car. I mean, it is nuts, dude.
Dynamically, it's weird, even though this is supposed to be the same as the Spider, it must be tires or alignment. There's a little bit more edge here, but in the best kind of way. It makes you correct. It rotates under throttle, it rotates under braking, it rotates when you lift. It does everything you want it to do. And because the motor is, I mean, it's powerful, it's 400 horsepower, and it, you know, obviously, it revs to the moon, it still allows you to experience what this thing has to offer without overwhelming you with horsepower. It's not scary like a 911 Turbo S or a McLaren 650 or even a 650 horsepower Z06. It allows you to grow within what this car has to offer. It's super, super addicting to drive hard, and it's got pretty incredible dynamics.
No, you can tell instantly. The what's going to hold you back here is it doesn't have the power of the GT3 in a straight line, obviously, and the other part of it is that you as a driver are what's holding this car back. This allows you. This is one of those few cars where you can actually
learn a few things about driving, and I could tell right away you need to work on your smoothness. Your jerky inputs from wanting to make this thing go sideways is slowing you down so much.
I don't disagree. This will be a really good car for someone like myself who has a fair bit of track experience but needs to work on their inputs. This is a car that makes you work for its rewards, but also punishes you if you mess up, which is kind of what you want in a car you're spending $120,000 on potentially, and you're going to take to track days like this, or take on your favorite kind of back road.
This is what sells this car. Like, there's an enormous wow factor to getting out here and going flat out, listening to the engine. It doesn't sound like a fake symposium of Casio keyboards. I mean, there is so much going for this, but I think it's completely fair also to talk about the street manners as well.
So that's where we come back to earth a little bit, Mark. It's, let's call it, it's not the best street car. On a back road, it's fun, but it has all the same problems we have with like a Spider, even the GTS 4-liter. Even with the PDK, the gearing hurts this car. Basically, by the time you're in second gear, depending on where you live, you're risking jail time. Definitely when you get into third, you're hitting triple digits. The ride quality compared to a GTS product is definitely on the stiffer side. And the engine is, because it's inside the cab with you, like I talked about in the interior segment, it's always present. If you're looking for that long distance GT car, there's a sense of droniness that Caymans have, particularly with this 4-liter. And if that's a deal breaker for you, if that's a real problem, then...
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see how this would get old on the street, but again, you're not buying a GT car, as your Sunday cruiser. I would hope that you are out experiencing this car like right now going on the track. And we talk about this endlessly. What makes a great track car, a track weapon that you can grow with, does not necessarily translate well to the street, but I think out of anybody, Porsche really knows how to do that and mix both worlds together.
And you, theoretically, right, unlike something like a Lotus, you could drive this every single day. Will you kind of hate yourself for it?
Right, yeah.
Okay, not every single day, but you could theoretically take it to work and not hate yourself.
And I think that's where the Evora GT that we got out of, like, I tired really quick of that car on the street. I mean, it lost its charm real quick, like most Lotuses do. And in Mira, I have no idea, but this thing is, I mean, I would love to own a car like this, and anybody that's a real driver who needs a driver's car is not going to find much better anything on the planet for around $110,000 to $120,000 if you can even get it for that.
Final thoughts on the 718 GT4. And let's be honest, in the era of turbochargers, hybrids, and decreased displacement engines, it's pretty hard to argue with a 4-liter flat 6 that revs to 8,000 RPM, a car that has a connected feeling that requires you to work for its rewards, a stellar resale value, a historically great sense of reliability or track record of reliability, and the fact that this car has genuine motorsports pedigree. And when you compare it to the prior generation 981 GT4, they've done a lot of, let's call it, improvements to engineering to overall improve your experience when you're buying this thing. It's a pretty spectacular car. And when it comes to negatives, there are a couple. To be honest, if you own the prior generation car, there's probably not enough different to make you want to spend the $20,000 or $30,000 to upgrade. The prior generation motor, despite being less effective and probably a less impressive motor overall, does sound a little bit better. And when you compare it to something like a C8, it lacks the low-end torque or the front-end connectedness of something like an Evora GT. But that said, this is one of the few cars that blends nearly everything together in a nearly perfect package. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.